So when did Grandpa start from the beginning, when Grandpa started in aviation was when you were born, right?
Yes. Actually, let me go to the beginning. My father was born in 1908, Jose Antonio. He was born to a merchant family. They had a bakery in town.
Right.
My grandfather, his dad, was a hatter. He had a store that serviced hats. Those days, most men wore a hat. In a town called Cauto Embarcadero. When my father was growing up, from 1908, one of the things that always had his interest was the fact that aviation was becoming the big news. You know, it was before, right around World War I, 1914 to 1918, and he was fascinated by seeing planes made of sticks and wire and fabric fly. So he used to make model planes in those days using small strips of wood and using tissue paper. My grandfather, his dad, was a very stern individual. He actually told him, he says, don't waste your time, make sure you just go to work in the family business, so on and so forth. But as the years went by, he started out with the business of repairing bicycles. A little bit of a history like the Wright brothers. He had a bicycle shop. Later on, he became a motorcycle shop. He became an avid motorcycle rider. He belonged to a club that they used to do stunts. And then, you know, that was a period between 1920 and the end of 1930s. Late in the 30s, with the beginning of World War II, he had a business that made shoe polishes. Most of his raw materials came from Germany, in Cuba, believe it or not. And with the outbreak of the war in Europe, my father could not get the materials. So he gave up on the raw materials, and he had in his mind that the people in my hometown, which is an industrial with agribusinesses around, one of the main industries there was, for example, a plant built by Nestle Corporation out of Switzerland. There were no buses for the people to move about. They either had to walk, bicycle, or use horse-drawn carriages, which were used as taxis. It was a very long town because it was along a river, and my father came up with the idea of a bus, making a bus line. His first bus he created. He bought an old Mack truck, took the cabin apart. He just kept the chassis. With the chassis, he built a bus made out of wood and metal with the windows just to look like a regular bus with one minor detail. He couldn't get the headlights because, again, he was rationing because it was World War II.
Yeah.
So he looked around and he got an idea of taking a light from a retired railroad car, which had a single big line, light in front. And he used to call it, the people used to call it the Cyclops, because it only had one eye.
So it was the only bus in town.
And he was the only bus in town. It was it was a mild success because at the beginning, people refused to ride it. So he had to give him free rides for about six months, with my grandfather, the hatter, being the guy that was in charge of making sure people that got on board, explained to them that when the service started, he was going to allow them to save a lot of time going to work, especially to the dairy plant for nursery. So sure enough, people got on board. 1944, 43, even 45 early. He was doing well. He had about 3 or 4 buses at the time. Just to give you an idea, one bus in a day running from 5 o'clock in the morning until about midnight would actually go 800 kilometers, which is about 500 miles. So they would run a lot. But the idea of aviation stayed with him. So he decided to learn to fly. He picked up on a friend of his that actually was a pilot that used to do stunts for shows in small towns, taught him how to fly the basics, and then he ordered a plane, his first plane, a Piper Cub J3 from Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, right from William T. Piper, from the factory. The plane arrived in a box with the engine and everything, just like if you buy a model plane.
Yeah.
And he put it together from instructions. He had put the books. Most of the aviation books in Cuba at the time, those in Spanish, were actually made in Argentina. Argentina at the time had a fairly developed aviation industry. South America in particular, because of the distances. Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, so on and so forth. They were using mostly Fokker, tri-engine aircraft for transportation, and that was basically the way they got around. Some of them were actually they also brought the Ford tri-motor.
Yeah.
So my father bought the plane, brought it. In the meantime, he met my mother, 1944-45, and married her. I was born in 1945, at the end of the war, June 1945. And there are some pictures around the house where, as my father put the plane together, my father and my mother would put me in diapers sitting in the plane so people could get an idea of what the plane looked like, with pictures, no video, of course. So he got the plane put together, and it was the first civilian registered aircraft called CUN-1. CUN in Cuba means Cuban Normal, which meant that it was a Cuban commercial aircraft. Non-commercial, but non-passenger transport. He got his license. He first basically soloed himself. That meant that he learned the basic skills for what they call pilotage by himself, just by trying takes off and landing, short one, short hops. There was a big piece of land outside town that belonged to the county where we lived. And my father by that time had developed a lot of political connections. And he was able to get a 100-year lease on a piece of land and set up the first municipal airport in my hometown. He had one feature. It was very flat land, even though it was a dirt runway rather. It was 9 kilometers from the town. Nowadays, if you take a look at a Google map, the place where the runway used to be is actually surrounded by housing, and it's all populated. They destroyed the airport after the revolution. And when my father developed the airport, he developed an FBO, fixed base operation, and developed a following, even in not only in Cuba, but in the U.S., where there were people that used to fly light-duty single-engine aviation aircraft.
H-18s.
Yeah, H-18s, also twins, light twins. The beginnings of the Piper Aztecs, Piper Comanche, twin Comanches. They used to go for overhauls to my father's airport. At that point, besides being an operator of the airport, he developed an air taxi system for the area, for mostly the wealthy people that had dirt runways in their own farms up in the hills. My father did very well. The revolution started actually in 1953, but the real breakout of the revolution was in late 1957, 56 rather, and it was fought 57, 58. My father's airport had the ability that he had a very long runway, so my father, who had befriended Batista, the dictator at the time, when he was in motorcycles in the 1930s, talked to him and offered the airport, not free, he offered them for rent, to build a runway that was actually supportable for military aircraft, B-26s, C-46s, C-47s. There was even a couple of Thunderbolts, P-47s that the Cuban Air Force had. There was even 2, I think, Mustangs, P-51s from World War II. A lot of AP-6s that were converted, but there was a development that would remind you of what happened in Vietnam, where they started using lighter aircraft like Piper Cubs. to be spotters
Yeah.
for the armed forces. And my father actually helped develop the system to put a 30 caliber machine gun on a rail, and the pilot would fly with somebody in the back seat and actually use the machine gun to fire from the plane sitting down. The other development was an interesting one, was taking a hand grenade, a pineapple,
Yeah.
and when you take the pin off, instead of just throwing it down, you would put it inside a glass container, glass jar, throw it, and when it hit the ground, that the glass jar would open, crack, the grenade would explode. So they became light bombers, so to speak. So the revolution started. The base was very functional. We had even a training ground for some of the military recruits. The revolution actually, while it was going on, charged my father with aiding the government to fight the rebels.
When did they start? When was the base active in what year?
56 to 57.
And the revolutionary
It
was
started, no, the base started, the revolution, when the revolution started in December of 56, the first military plane that landed
yeah.
with a colonel that came from a Marine detachment, Cuban Marines, actually landed in my father's airport. So my father right away made a deal and says, you can use a certain area of the airport to set it up as a base. They build billets, they build for places where the crews and the maintenance crews and the pilots could live in. And before you knew it, there was like about half a dozen planes all the time there, and a couple of tanks to protect the air base. A few times the rebels tried to attack it, but the place was so flat that if you had a plane flying, you could see them. And at one point, my brother, who was already a pilot at the time, was flying around in the Piper Cup that we owned, that we still kept it, even though at that time we owned the best plane we ever had, which was a Cessna 180, which my father also used as an air ambulance. They tried to actually shoot my brother down. So, but my brother didn't notice that they had been shooting at him.
Because it's a bad recovery aircraft.
Yeah, until he landed and he saw that there were a bunch of holes in some of the tail surfaces.
What were some of the planes that Grandpa owned?
He owned the Piper Cup, he owned Tri-Pacers, he owns Air Coups, he owned Piper Cruisers, Super Cruisers. He owned Cessna 140, a 170, and finally the Cessna 180.
Did he own them all at the same time?
No, one at a time. He usually had never more than 2 planes, one for training, always a Piper Cup.
Yeah.
Because, for example, the Piper Cup that we had, CON1, had wooden spars, and it was really not meant for a trainer that could be abused because it was somewhat fragile. So eventually we got
Piper Cups were. So.
Yeah. So eventually we got Piper Cups like the J5s and the A18s and the Super Cups that had bigger engines, not 65 horsepower anymore. And that's what my father used for the training school.
But he had a Super Cruiser also.
Yeah, the Super Cruiser was interesting because most people don't realize that it was a plane that, even though he only carried 3 people, the passenger, the pilot, and 2 passengers, he had a very long range because he was meant to be a cruiser for families, for a young family, husband, wife, and a child. And my father actually flew it to Mexico over water, flew it to Haiti, flew it to Jamaica, because he belonged also to a new club, which was a private pilot club. So, and my father also did acrobatics. He used the Piper Cup to do acrobatics. He organized air shows so people could see it. Remember, this town was a town in the middle of literally nowhere. So my father was well liked in town because he was an innovator. And when the airport was militarized, it was interesting for me in particular just to watch, to see the military aircraft come in and land. The revolution triumphed, January 1959, the government fled, and Castro's government took over. Soon thereafter, they started nationalizing all businesses, which means it was nationalizing, no, it was actually stealing the businesses from private hands. I remember we were in Havana the day that changing government came. It was New Year's Eve, December 31st, 1958. Things were really bad, but by no means the government, the army really had no laws. It just got very corrupt, very weakened by internal dissension within even people that supported the government. And we woke up in January 1959 with the news that Batista, the president, had left the island. And then Fidel, who was still in the hills around my hometown where we had the airport, came down very triumphant, like a liberator, and they started driving with a caravan to Havana. They got to Havana. Remember, the government collapsed January 1. Fidel didn't get to Havana until January 7th, 6th or 7th.
So 7 days to go from Miami to Havana.
Right, because the roads were actually, a lot of them were dilapidated. They had torn down bridges during the revolution. So it was hard. And people just, everybody was happy. Everybody thought it was going to be a great thing for Cuba to have the revolution take over. Because they kept promising all kinds of free things, free housing, free schooling, free medicine, so on and so forth. The kinds of things that socialist governments usually promise. In one of his speeches, actually, Fidel, one of his speeches, he even promised to do away with the armed forces. That he was just going to have a police department just to keep the peace in towns. Well, that never came to happen. So what happened within the first 6 months is that everybody that was powerful, rich, professionals, intellectuals, realized that it was really a communist government coming in. My oldest brother, Carlos, worked at the Cuban National Bank at the time, and that's when Che Guevara came in and became the head of the Cuban National Bank. Guerrilla guy, didn't know anything about finance, but he was put in charge of the bank accounts, so to speak. Things started really getting bad. They started nationalizing in 1960. They did it in stages, but fast. They first nationalized large American companies, like the casinos, because they were run by in many cases by the mob. They nationalized the fuel companies because the government started falling behind in payments for petroleum. Cuba was not self-sufficient, so they brought in petroleum into, I think it was 3 refineries that they had. One owned by Texaco, one owned by Standard Oil, which was Exxon, and I think one from Shell, if I remember correctly. Maybe I'm wrong, but there were 3 major ones. And Russia right away offered petroleum to Cuba, but the Russian petroleum was not the same type of crude that was being processed in Cuba, which was a lighter crude. So the excuse was used that the American refineries refused to process the oil for the Cuban people, and the government took it over. So they threw them out. So that was the first big major nationalization. The next one were the sugar mills. The illusion that they gave was that the sugar industry in Cuba, which at the time used to produce up to 8 million tons a year, was one of the major producers of sugar in the world. And they promised that they were going to make it part of the Cuban national wealth, because they were being exploited, and they claimed most of the sugar mills were owned by American foreign companies, which was not true. There were some that were, like Hershey Chocolate. They had a big refinery, but it was well run, employees were well paid, and it was a big contributor of wealth to Cuba. There were others, like even Chiquita, who started out with some sugar mills, not just the fruit business, so on and so forth. But most of the sugar industry in Cuba was actually privately owned by very wealthy individuals. Some of them, like the Fanjuls, which are now in the U.S., that they own big sugar producing facilities in Florida, were there. There was another gentleman by the name of Julio Lobo, who was called the sugar baron, because he not only had his own sugar mills, but he was also traded on a worldwide basis, and he became one of the drivers sometimes of how the pricing of sugar was settled in the London Mercantile Exchange. So Cuba was a country that the revolution came about because there was unhappiness with the regime.
Really the Batista regime,
but there was not because we needed a revolution to fix what they call the social problems of the island. They were poor, there was poverty, but Cuba had a very high rate of entrepreneurship, alphabetization. People were literate. The schools were, you could go to medical school for free. Yeah. It only cost you like $40 a year to register, and even that, they would waive it if you're poor. I have a friend of mine that's 97 now, that he actually grew up in a very, very poor household, and he went to the government-sponsored military school and actually became a trained engineer at this place. And from that, he developed a lot of industrial processes to work in the sugar industry, including methods of logistics of how to move the sugar cane to the sugar mill. And he became a millionaire. And, you know, he's in the U.S. since 1962, 63. So the revolution took over. Dissent within the ranks of the Cuban Revolution started right away, about late 59, early 60s. There were some rebellious attempts of people to go to the hills to fight Fidel already. One of them in a mountains called El Escambray. At one point there were supposedly as many as 10,000 people in the hills fighting. Fidel by that time had reached a military assistance agreement with Russia, and he brought some Russian military trainers and assistants, and they developed a technique to basically sweep clean any forests in Cuba that where rebels could hide.
When did the Bay of Pigs, the 5 days leading up to the Bay of Pigs, when did you find out? Because I know it was dark. You know, media was owned by the government by this time. When did you find out that there was an invasion going on?
Actually, unfortunately, we knew that there was an invasion in the making very early, which means that Fidel also knew it.
So 1963, it was
1961.
61 is when it started wording about.
Let me explain it to you. About 1960 already, there was a lot of Cubans that had left Cuba already. People with money, people without money. The wealthy of Cuba were not the only ones that left the island. There were students, there were teachers, there were workers, and they all obviously came through Miami. The CIA had started even before Kennedy got elected in 1960 under the Eisenhower administration. They were pretty convinced that Nixon was going to win in 1960, and they had set up a program to basically topple Fidel. They started by recruiting Cuban military individuals. They would infiltrate him to do sabotage in Cuba, so on and so forth. But then they started, when Castro manifested that it was a socialist communist revolution, they actually set up in motion the program that would eventually become Bay of Pigs. Talking about 1960. They had started before, but it really took shape in early 1960. They set up training bases in the Everglades, and then training bases in Guatemala and in Nicaragua. Nicaragua because it was the port, Puerto Cabezas. In Guatemala, where some of my friends from military school went to, they had the airport where they trained the pilots for the bombers and for the C-46s for the parachute regiment, and also for the ground forces that would be landing from the ships once they took off from Nicaragua. You're talking about the beginning of 61. Everybody knew that something was going on. Everybody knew that if you left Cuba, chances are you would be aware of Miami that the CIA was recruiting for an eventual invasion. The issue was what that was going to be was how much was the U.S. going to be involved in it, how big was it going to be, where is it going to be, and whether it's going to be one invasion or multiple ones. The plan that actually the Kennedys inherited when they took over in January of 61, a mere 5 months before the invasion, was pretty much cast in stone. They were going to invade a town called Trinidad in the south of Cuba because, number one, it gave access to the hills in central Cuba. Number two, it had a port. Number three, it had a good airport. And they felt that it could actually take it and cut off any attempts to counterattack from the Cuban government. Just as a historical aside, by that time, the Cuban government had actually trained significant amounts of military people under Russian sponsorship. It happened that the individual that ran the training for artillery was an individual who originally came from Spain, and he was actually one of my instructors in military school for infantry. He was a specialist in artillery. He was a Spaniard. So at the last minute, the Kennedy administration, number one, they started having second thoughts about U.S. involvement. Even though they deployed a Navy detachment, which I believe it was the Boxer, the original aircraft carrier, not the modern version of the Boxer, in south of Cuba, with submarines and some air assets like A-4s and a few other aircraft. The gross on the invasion was about 2,000 people, 2,000 trainers. The objective was that once they landed, they would have enough people already in the island that could add to the fighting force, and they would be able to arm this. They were bringing arms. There were 5 ships. 2 of the ships that had the heavy arms actually were the first to be sunk. When just before the invasion, some of the softening took place. The Monday of the invasion, April 17th, was preceded by 5 days of activity. One of them was in Havana. They burned a couple of very large stores as acts of sabotage. Saturday morning, 48 hours before the invasion, B-26s flying from Nicaragua came and strafed and attacked the main air base in Havana, Colombia, which was the headquarters of the Cuban Air Force and Army. Destroyed some. Santiago de Cuba, close to where I grew up, close to the naval base, also they destroyed a couple of aircraft. And some of the planes actually, instead of flying back to Nicaragua, came to Key West and Miami, and they tried to create the image or the impression that there were defectors from the Cuban Air Force. At that point, the issue became for the American government to face the fact that this was already going on, and the Cuban government knew that these guys were not really Cuban pilots from the Cuban government, but Cuban exiles flying out of Nicaragua. So Bobby Kennedy, who was Attorney General and the right-hand man of his brother JFK, decided that they would not allow those planes to take off again, because the planes only came here to refuel. They would go back to Nicaragua, rearm, and then join the main force. But the advantage was that they would have actually flown over Cuba to actually do more softening of Castro's forces and where the military assets were. A couple of assets that survived the attack that were super critical, aviation assets. Cuba had some T-33s that were actually armed with 50 caliber machine guns, 2 T-33 jets. They had 2 Sea Furies that had 20 and 40 millimeter cannon, British aircraft, that Cuba had bought, the Cuban government before Castro had bought when the US embargoed Cuba from buying American weapons. So the UK, England, actually sold replacement ordnance like bombs, rockets, and munitions. I think it was 4 Sea Furies and also some helicopters made by Westland, which was the equivalent of the S-55 Sikorsky as well. So with those 2 survivors, 1-on-1, it was enough to counter the Cuban Air Force, the rebel Air Force, the invasion, because the B-26s had such a long leg to fly from Nicaragua that they had to give up some of the protective firepower on board, like to be able to fire to the rear. And they had actually, the nose cone was actually for strafing. You had 8 50 caliber machine guns, which actually played a role in how the U.S., the Kennedy administration, decided not to support it, because the Cuban government said those planes are not Cuban, stolen by Cuban pilots, because our planes have the bubble canopy, the bubble nose, or the B-26s, or the real Cuban Air Force.
So Castro had the older version of the B-26,
That's
not
correct.
the newer one, strafing machine.
Right, which were the ones that
That was the
eventually were
attack
using.
version.
Yeah, they became the 826s. Were planes that were taken from the Alabama National Guard, and some of the pilot trainers, some of them actually died fighting over the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Why was it picked that they went from the port in Cuba, which was close to you guys? from
Why
the
did they
port?
change?
When did the change happen?
What happened was they felt that the port in itself was compromised. If you remember from World War II, when they were deciding on D-Day, the Germans always expected the Americans to land either in Pas de Calais, because you have ports,
Yeah.
or Cherbourg, which was a port. But they decided to go through Normandy, which was an open beach. It was the same type of mentality, I guess. So they actually moved it from Trinidad, which was a town,
Yeah.
and it was a historical town. It was one of the third or fourth oldest towns in the Western Hemisphere, founded by the Spaniards. Very picturesque. Today it's a World Heritage Site by the UN, because it's got a lot of the old architecture from the days of the Spanish colony. So they moved it to Bahia de Cochinos, which is actually a swamp in Zapata, which is the biggest swamp in Cuba, filled with crocodiles and alligators, snakes. Very difficult to get in and out, which if you have an overwhelming force landing and you control the entrance, fine if you support it. But in this case, when the fighters landed, they lost the two ships with additional tanks and ammunition. The planes got shut down. They kept asking the American Navy that was close by for support, and the only support they got was a flyby. They were not authorized to engage, even though the pilots on those American planes kept telling, please, they're massacring. There is a massacre going on the beach. These guys are surrounded. They're running out of ammunition. The Kennedy administration refused to accept the fact that they were committed. And if you are a reader of history, in a post-analysis of the action, when they had a meeting in the White House weeks later after the Bay of Pigs was a disaster, everybody had surrendered. They captured 1,200 people, besides the 200-300 that died. When there was a meeting in the White House, the chief of staff at the time, which I think he was the guy that was a paratrooper in World War II, I forget now, Maxwell Taylor, may have been the one working for the Kennedy administration, made the point saying, look, we knew that they were going to call us liars, and we knew that everybody would know that it was U.S. support. So if we want to be called all kinds of dirty names, at least let it be for the right reason, not because we abandoned these people. But that was the end of it. I mean, once they made a decision not to provide air support, the invasion could not succeed. In addition, there was another detachment that was going to land in North Cuba, in the province where I grew up. Actually, not quite close, but just to make a distraction and separate Castro's forces. But what happened, when they were waiting to land, they saw guards smoking on the beach, so they thought it was a trap. So they never landed, and they retreated. There was only 2 ships, but that would have been enough to land a couple of hundred guys well armed, and they could have taken over one of the towns, which had a good bay, which was in Nipe, where the Mikado Nickel Company worked, where Chiquita had a pier. So it would have been strategically a good distraction and a good place to probably put pressure on it. By canceling that and making sure the guys in Bay of Pigs were surrounded, they were down to a one runway that they enabled, that only used a couple of times, and the road that went on the along the beach. An interesting tidbit of history or trivia: there was a gentleman that was in the invasion force from my hometown. That at one point he was part of a reconnaissance group that was hiding in the mangroves, and they saw a tank with two jeeps come, and none other than Fidel Castro got up on top of the tank with binoculars to look at what was happening on the beach. This gentleman had a machine gun, could have killed him, and what he did, he surrendered and said, "I never fired the gun." So let me put it this way: 40 years later, when he died in Miami, nobody went to his funeral. Can you imagine an act of like July 20th bombing in Germany when they tried to kill Hitler? If they had killed Fidel at that point, the government would have collapsed.
So the invasion is a total loss. They used B-26s, the American side. They used A4. They didn't use A4s, but they just did overflights. When did you find out what happened during the invasion? What was going on in the towns and cities where you were?
Okay.
When did you find out what was going on?
My father, my mother, my two brothers, and I were in Havana by coincidence. We were not in our hometown, which was in the eastern provinces.
Grandpa had already lost the airport at that time.
At that point, he hadn't lost it, but he still had access to it.
But he had an airplane.
Yeah, he had an airplane. So in fact, we had an air coup. That was the plane we were going to steal, or an Antonov, Russian plane,
AN-12.
AN-2.
And
Biplane. The biplane that we could have stolen, but eventually we got visas and we were able to get out. But we were in Havana that weekend, and one of the things the government did right away, Fidel government, was rounded up anybody that was not clearly identified as favoring the government. So in every big town, they used stadiums, movie houses, clubs, cattle pens to hold people up, to make sure there was no ability by the revolution fighters to call people to arms or give them arms to become part of a popular army.
Kind of like the Japanese.
Like the Japanese. They were internment camps. So my brothers and I and my father and my mother, we escaped that just by a coincidence, because we had an apartment in Havana and it was under somebody else's name. It was a rental. So they didn't know where we were. So that was Saturday. They started picking up people right away after the attacks on the bases on Saturday, but in earnest, in big numbers. That started Monday morning as the invasion was going on. We were listening to shortwave radio. There was a radio station called Radio Swan. Radio Swan was a transmitter that was in Swan Island, which was by Cayman, in the Gulf of Mexico, at the entrance to the Gulf of Mexico. And they were reporting that the invasion was going, real psychological ops. But some of the stuff they were saying, we said, this is crazy. They were saying the troops are landing such and such a place, places that everybody in Cuba do. There's no beaches there.
Yeah.
They even used my hometown. My hometown was 60 miles inland. So a lot of what they were thinking that would help confuse the issue or inform the people failed. In addition, there were people that had infiltrated Cuba before to be ready for the day of the invasion. The CIA never told them the invasion is coming Monday. So these guys, they found themselves stranded in Cuba with no guns, no radios, no response. Some of them wound up being captured. Some of them wound up being actually walking into embassies in Havana and get out. And some of them actually eventually left through clandestine methods. So it was a total screw up, total betrayal, a total lie of the way they put it together. There was a total disregard. We're actually surprised that of the 1,200 people that got captured, only some died in prison or in the transport of trucks, which, by the way, the trucks alone were intended to kill many, because they would fill the trucks up, close the doors without any ventilation. So guys would take turns to actually put their nose next to whatever crack they could find on the trucks and they were called the Camiones de la Muerte, death trucks.
And those were death trucks they were using these trucks to pick up the prisoners from the beach.
From the beach, and they took them then to Havana, and they actually held them there and eventually that's where they were released from when the American government, JFK, actually reached an agreement to swap them for medicines and dollars and heavy equipment tractors. So essentially they bought their freedom. I had an interesting story. As you remember at the beginning, I told you that some of the guys were very young. I was 16. I have friends from my military school that were 17 that were in the invasion. Their parents either authorized them or they lied to get in.
Yeah.
And one of them, with a friend, actually was being held in a high security prison, and they managed to escape in Havana.
So it wasn't so high security.
So not only that, it's funny because they get out, they're in the middle of the city. At this point, Havana was still a very functioning city, so there were buses running, so on and so forth. They know that the invasion has failed. It's days after the invasion or weeks after. And they started looking for places to make connections to get away from Cuba. One of them went to a girlfriend, and she says, "You're just gonna come here because they probably watching me already." So they went all over town. They even went to a restaurant and ate in a bar. Eventually they realized, we don't know what we're gonna do. So they went back to jail. They turned themselves in. They went back to jail. These guys were 18 years old. So eventually one of them became a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, served in the Army honorably in Vietnam, and also as an advisor to the Salvadoran Army when they were fighting the communist guerrillas in the 1970s, 80s.
When did you guys got out? But where did you guys go when you left?
When I left Cuba,
How did you leave Cuba?
okay, I was still in the military school. They hadn't closed it completely. It was probably weeks away from it because it was early '61.
Okay.
So I'm in uniform from the academy. Remember, at that point, the Cuban population really wasn't sure of what the hell was going on. So
Grandpa was in jail at the time, right?
one of the times, every time that they threw him in jail, we would probably be able to get him out in 5, 6, 7 days.
Practically knew everybody in jail. by
Yeah,
that time.
not only that, we still have friends, even with Fidel's government. In particular, Fidel's assistant, the woman, Celia Sanchez, my babysitter, was a friend of hers.
Okay.
So she went and spoke for my father. The worst accusations that they had against my father, in which they asked him for death penalty twice, became non-events because the people that accused my father actually left Cuba.
Had already left Cuba, and that was the one where the man died of a heart attack, right?
That's correct.
And they tried to say that he killed him.
Yeah, exactly. Not only that, it was not only the heart attack, it was 1953 when Fidel and his brother attacked the barracks to start the first phase of the revolution. Remember, the real revolution started November of '56. The first attack was 26th of July 1953. Fidel and his brother get thrown in jail. They get a pardon, go to Mexico in early '56, and that's when they put the invasion together, the landing to start the revolution.
So you get ready to try and hatch your plan to get out of Cuba in
Right.
'61, late
Well,
'61.
that's right. I'm coming back from school to the apartment in Havana where we were hiding after Bay of Pigs. At this time, Bay of Pigs had not happened. It's only weeks away. And I see this gentleman who's dressed as a priest. And I recognize him. He's a priest from my hometown.
Bay of
I-
Pigs had already happened.
No, it hasn't happened.
Okay.
This is about February, March
Okay.
of '61. Bay of Pigs was April of '61. So probably closer to February. So I see the
Remember his
priest.
name?
Yes, I'll remember in a second.
Sorry.
But I remember him. Was from my hometown. I went to raise my hand to say hello to him in the bus. We were shrouded. Remember, the government was already cracking down on dissent, was cracking down on the church. So he went like this to tell me to shut up. and indicated to me get off the next stop. By name, I remember the name, Roberto Soler del Yunde. I think he died recently, as a matter of fact. He was a retired priest in Puerto Rico. So we get off, we meet. He asked me, he says, what are you trying to do? I says, I'm trying to get out. I got all my papers. I didn't want to come here illegally or on a boat because the risk was too high of drowning in the Gulf. My mother and father would not let me do it. My brother and I were planning to steal a plane, one of our own planes. But since we didn't have enough gasoline, we would have to steal gasoline to make sure we could make it out of Cuba with enough fuel. So he says, if you have all the papers, come to the seminar, which was also a place where the monks lived, the La Salle brothers, and bring all your papers. So I went there, and they gave me a waiver visa, which was a visa authorized, actually created by the American government to be used by the church under Operation Pedro Pan, Peter Pan, yeah, which is, they will give you, especially for minors. So I got that, and I was told that I will be getting out soon. They will let me know. In the meantime, Bay of Pigs happened. I get worried that I'm not going to be able to get out. I hadn't been told what date I was supposed to get out. So right after the Bay of Pigs, that when it failed, the government did open again the flights to Cuba. The animosity with the U.S. Had not grown to that point yet, especially with the communist infiltration. So they told us, they told me, hang on to the papers, we're going to start the flights again. I get a call late July 61 saying, go to the seminary at such and such a date, bring $25 US in cash, and you're going to get a ticket, the visa, and also make sure you carry a cigar box with you when you get out. The cigar box was a funny thing because actually they knew that when we landed in Miami, we could sell the cigar box for $25. That was 1 week's salary for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So that would be pocket money for us because most of us were minors. We didn't have, but we needed to have either a sponsor or a relative in the U.S. I had my godmother waiting for me in Miami. So her son actually stole the cigar box from me. So I didn't get any benefit out of the $25. But he, when they tell me go August the 2nd or the 1st to go pick up 1961, go to pick up the tickets on board. So I was told I had to wear a Roman color, I had to have a Bible, I had to have papers saying that I was going to study my priesthood in Canada, that Miami was actually stopover. It was a lie. It was to make sure I could get out of Cuba. So I actually left on a flight sponsored by the Catholic Church and some Jewish groups out of Miami that actually worked very closely with the Catholic Church to get children out of Cuba particularly. The plane was a Douglas DC-6 of Pan Am Airways, and it had 100 people on board, of which about 18 were like us, children, boys and girls that were getting out. The rest were nuns and priests that were being thrown out of Cuba.
When did Castro start to close the churches? Right after he took over?
Pretty much within 2 years. They started animosity. At the beginning, when they came out from the hills, the rebels would wear rosaries to show that they were Christians. But as soon as they started executing people, there were some priests even that actually became chaplains to the rebel army, so they were excommunicated. Some of the bishops in Cuba started talking against the executions without trial, jailings without trial, the excesses of the revolution, so on and so forth. So it was obvious that once the full force of being a communist regime came into being, that they would break away from the church, because Christianity, Catholicism, is incompatible with communism. They just used it as an excuse at the beginning to give people the comfort that, hey, these guys cannot be communists, they're hanging around with a rosary around their necks.
When did Grandpa leave Cuba? He left after you did.
Exactly.
But you were already here a couple of years before he left.
Well, he left in 1968. What happened is, actually, your brother was about born.
Yeah.
What
How
happened?
did he get out?
My father, what happened was the following. Once he cleared all his jail issues, that what they were in persecution, what they were not, and he was lucky, let me tell you, he could have been executed very easily, but they executed people for a lie. So my father gets out for the prison things. They finally take all the properties away, but he's allowed to live in the house that we had built on top of one of the businesses because that was his house. His homestead.
That was where the bakery was.
No, actually, where the shop, the machine shop,
Yeah.
and the automobile, the bus repair. Because remember, not only we own the airport, we own the bus line in town.
Which eventually became part of the government.
Exactly, they took it all. So my father actually was making some money doing repairs on the side, and he had saved some money. Even when the government changed the currency, my brother, who had been at the time working for the central bank, told my father, if you have any Cuban currency, the old one, give it to me so I can convert it to the new currency. Otherwise, you'll be subject to a limit, which at the time was ridiculous. It was like a couple of $1,000s or so. My father had a significant amount of money stashed from when we owned the bus, but he's still surviving. He actually had taken up the role of caretaker of two of my nieces, because my middle brother had already was leaving Cuba soon when we left in '61. My oldest brother left Cuba in December of 1960, early '61. I left April of '61. My middle brother left in November, December of '61. So we left about 6 months.
Everybody left in '61.
That's right. And my father stayed. Part of it, my father had blind faith that any day the U.S. Marines will land.
And John Wayne would
That's right.
come out.
Exactly. And, you know, the Star Spangled Banners will be leading the charge against the Cuban government. When the missile crisis came in '62,
He was there.
he was there. Actually, when I left in '61, I brought some of the initial markings where they were putting the missile bases, because somebody who I gathered, he must have been a CIA guy, came to see me. They knew I was leaving August of '61.
They were using the church at the time
To get
information.
messages out. So I had a piece of paper that was a handwritten letter to a relative, but he had invisible ink on the side, on the back, that had the plans of where the missile bases were. Most people didn't believe it. They couldn't tell that the government would be so bold, and that the United States would allow missiles to get into Cuba, Russian missiles.
But they were coming in on ships that were unmarked.
Unmarked, but still, the missiles were so big, which is unlike now, that they were on the top cargo deck of the ship, so they could tell they were missiles. I mean, eventually, you've seen clips from the time where they show the ships loaded with missiles. But the first thing they introduced was the construction battalions that were building the missile bases.
When did you start seeing Russians in Cuba? 'Cause I know you saw-
1959, 60, they had a trade show. Some Russian goods, including watches, consumer products,
you
came in.
started seeing Russians.
Exactly. And you could tell that the Russians were on a bus because they stank.
They were all white.
They were all white pale.
Yeah.
And
Never seen sunlight.
not only that, they didn't know what deodorant was. So it was a very, very telling. That when they lifted their arm on the bus, it was a weapon of mass destruction. So, but that was funny, but it was true.
So Grandpa gets out in '68. How is it that he got out?
I actually claimed him because I was a minor.
Yeah.
So I
You were
actually put a
18, 20 with mom?
well in
Juan was
68 I was already in my 20s.
Okay.
Juan was already born. So
My brother, guys.
your brother, your oldest brother, was born in '68. You were born in '74. So my father says, I gotta get out. He didn't want to. My father would have probably been happy to have died in Cuba. But my mother said, look, I want to see my son. I'm my mother's only son. My brothers were half brothers. So
Carlito was out.
Yeah.
Papito was out.
yes, Carlos and Jose Antonio Jr. was out. We're out. So I put the papers through the State Department as a reunification proposal of family, claimed my mother and father out. They left in late '68 in what they call the Liberty flights, which were negotiated after the missile crisis. My father was able to get clearance to get out because he actually, whatever little property or things of value he owned, he turned it over to the government. So he basically, in addition to getting the visa through me, he bought his own freedom with whatever he had. It was such a painful process that, for example, they would come to your house, they would take inventory of the silverware, the dishes, the appliances. Oh, that appliance, there's a button that's broken. You have to replace it or we won't sign you off. Oh, the cutlery is incomplete. You got to find a way to leave it complete. So little picayune, stupid things like that, but nevertheless made to humiliate you. And he left some money to my sister, my oldest sister, who stayed and still is there in Cuba, dying of starvation. But she opted to stay because of her husband, who was already in the military. He was drafted. My brothers and I, our biggest fear was not that the revolution was communist, was that my brother, the one for the central bank, would have to become a member of the Communist Party to stay. I would have to sign for the military draft, and given my education level and training, they would have been sending me to Russia, Czechoslovakia for training. And my older brother, Papito, Antonio, being a pilot and a mechanic, would have been drafted right into the Air Force. So my father left because I claimed him and because he bought his way out in '68.
When did mom's parents leave?
About the same time.
You claimed them also?
No, what happened was the following. Your mother actually claimed her parents because she was a minor. Your mother is 3 years younger than I am.
Yeah.
So she was living with an aunt in New York, and she claimed it. Plus the fact that your grandmother was Mexican.
So she wasn't a Cuban resident?
She was a Cuban citizen, but she had the right to claim Mexican citizen privilege to get out. So she got the visa to get out through Mexico. She didn't come to the U.S. She went to Cuba to Mexico, Mexico to the U.S. There was a side story to that. Your uncle, who died, Felix, who died a while back, your uncle actually had been in a concentration camp, which actually messed up his mind. Yeah, it was a concentration camp. I mean, the re-education camp, whatever you want to call it, but it actually messed up his mind to the day he died. If you remember, sometimes he would stay, be very quiet, and all of a sudden go into a trance, so to speak, like if he was reliving the moment, so almost like PTSD. So he came out about your grandparents came in '68. Your uncle came, I think, about 1969, 70, because we went to pick him up at through Mexico. Actually, he came because your grandmother had actually claimed him. So that was it.
How many people did you know? So everybody left Cuba. By 1968, most of our family had gone. What of the many of the people that Grandpa knew? I remember you telling me a story of a gentleman who owned the Beach 18 with fixed landing gear, the stagger, and he got a lot of Cubans out on his plane. He stayed behind.
Yeah, he actually was caught and executed. And what happened was during the revolution.
Blue and orange,
Yeah.
Beach 18 with the fixed gear.
Yeah, he actually was caught and executed because even though he was a supporter of Castro, he turned against him, and they accused him. Actually, no, he was not a supporter of Castro. He actually kind of played a neutral game because he did some flights for the military, and they accused him of being a spy, and they executed him. Some of the survivors of Bay of Pigs, the pilots in particular, some of them wound up joining a special force of mercenaries paid by the CIA to fight in the Congo
Against Che Guevara.
against Che Guevara, called the Makasis, which meant bull in one of the local dialects. They actually came very close of capturing Che Guevara when he was in the Congo.
And they used, just for the record, T-28.
They used T-6s, T-28. The Cubans that were there, the armorers, the guys that prepare the guns, actually developed the pod with 250 caliber machine guns, one on each wing.
Which was eventually used on the B-26.
Exactly. So they were very good at that. They had good people. One of the episodes, and if anybody wants to see the video, go to the CIA website and said the Congo Civil War, the Congo guerrillas. They're going to see an episode of two Cubans that were flying a T-28. They get shot down by the rebels, the communist sponsor rebels, and eventually get eaten, cannibalized by them. And one of the guys got burned pretty badly. And there is actually a video made, a documentary made by the History Channel, where they interview the guy that survived, who got burned, and was saved by some tribesmen who took him into their care, saved him, and the Belgians, who controlled the Belgian Congo at the time, sent a helicopter, a Piasecki, the twin rotor one, to retrieve him and save him. And he's the one that testified to the fact that the guy that stayed behind wounded, they captured him and ate him up. And the theory was that among those savages, that if you ate the main organs of your enemy, you pick up his strength. So
They didn't get too much strength.
exactly. So, but that was sad because I have friends, you met one of them, that they were in their 20s and they fought in the Congo. It's amazing the amount of Cuban exiles that have fought against communism on behalf of the U.S. They fought in Vietnam. Many of them got a lot of condecorations. I know 3 in particular that were left with the rank of colonel from the Army, U.S. Army. One of them was intelligence. The other ones were infantry training and logistics. And even one, there was a Cuban general. He was the head of the Washington National Guard for a while. He had been on the invasion of Bay of Pigs. When they captured Che Guevara, the guy, Felix Rodriguez, not related to your parents, to your grandparents, was the guy that actually organized the troops and trained them, which went after Che Guevara and captured him. He didn't kill him. The Bolivian government gave the order to kill him to one of the Bolivian sergeants there, but he was with Che Guevara the last few minutes of his life before they executed him. And I consider him a friend and a real patriot because he put his life on the line.
Our family is gone from Cuba,
Except for my sister.
except your sister, and we have
The-
other family members.
The niece,
still,
yeah, my niece.
That's all we have left in Cuba. Everybody else is gone.
Yeah, we have distant cousins and all that, but they're adults my age and their kids are part of the system, or they just don't care.
For Castro, for Cuba to change, the military has to take over, correct?
Yeah, I actually get involved a lot with analyzing the economics and social issues. I actually give some presentations on local radio and local TV. As you know, I got an economics degree, and I worked 50 years in Latin America in corporate finance, so I know a little bit about what's going on. The basic failure of Cuba right now, the one that would be the best for the Cuban people, short of changing the regime, was to actually allow farmers, small farmers, to cultivate the land even at a subsistence level, because they don't even allow that. So there is hunger, poverty, scarcity, no power, nothing, total disaster, because the government is over controlling the economy and the people. They don't allow anything that could allow a person to gain money, make wealth, or be economically independent of the government. There's a lesson in that. You got to be careful what you wish for, because you may get it. The government had promised in 1959 that the Cuban government was going to take care of all the needs of all the people, and eventually what they need, they took all the needs and took all the wants. So what you want is not what you get, it's what the government wants.